Let's calibrate BenQ EX3210U for 99% Adobe RGB color space. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. In my full review for this Mobius EX3210U, I'll leave a link up here and below so you can check that out. I mentioned that this display can show 99% Adobe RGB, and it also happens to have a high 144Hz refresh rate 4K display. I mean, this seems to be a great combination for any creative who also happens to do any type of gaming and want a larger color gamut display. So even though those are all true, the one big disclaimer that I gave in that review video was that if you really need super color accuracy and you work with, for instance, the creative workflow, for instance, in photography, more so than you do gaming, my recommendation is to look at BenQ SW display line instead. Because that display, even though they both can show 99% Adobe RGB, the SW line has been calibrated with more pro color modes that you would use in your workflow. The panel have also been calibrated for uniformity from the factory, and it has many other things, for instance, a shading hood, the fact that it can go into vertical orientation, and also it has hardware calibration. This way you can run a calibration and get the most accurate color possible on the display so that you know you're looking at the right colors. But that aside, this display is really good. Although in the color mode for this display, in the menu, you can't find Adobe RGB in there at all, and that is because this is more of an entertainment display and not a pro display, which is the reason why BenQ did not calibrate this display in Adobe RGB color mode from the factory. Simply enough, you can just put this display color mode into custom and you can access that 99% Adobe RGB. But as I mentioned in the review as well, it's not quite as straightforward. There are certain settings that you need to tweak to get the best and most neutral baseline color possible, and I'm going to share that with you. As a disclaimer, what I am about to show you, treat this as a baseline, as a great starting point for you to use, and then examine your color workflow once you have done the calibration to see if this fits within your color workflow. How is your color looking when you're using these settings? You can certainly tweak these around based on what you see may fit better with your workflow, but that is something that you can certainly do. And as always, before you run any type of calibration on both Mac and PC, there are certain settings that you have to disable. For a Mac side, you have to disable HDR, make sure that's not on. True tone needs to be disabled, and preferably you should disable auto brightness on your display as well. This way it doesn't interfere with the external display linked up to the system. I'll leave a link to all these resources down in the description below so you can check that out. Now for the equipment that I have, obviously the EX3210U, I have my 16-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro. This is linked to the display using a USB-C to a full DisplayPort cable, and I'll put that in the description too. For the calibration device, I'll be using Calibrite ColorChecker Display Plus. Software-wise, I'll be using ColorChecker Profiler software to run the calibration. And for this, we're going to start out with the display menu because there are a few things we need to change. I have gone through and reset everything already, so this is as if I'm just pulling this out from the box and just setting it up for the first time. So what I'm going to do first is going to ask me if I want to enable full functions. I'm going to say confirm, and now it's asking me, because I am using DisplayPort, what do you want to do? Do you want to use DisplayPort for gaming, for cinema, or for standard? Well, I want to go with standard because I want things to be a little more neutral. Even though I go in standard now, the colors become much more saturated, but that's okay. Now the other thing about this display you're going to notice as well is that the menu dismisses itself fairly quickly by default. So we're going to go and change that first. If you press any button once the menu is gone, you can just simply pull up this quick menu. I'm going to go down to menu, and now I have the full menu. Simply go down to System, OSD setting, and down to display time. I'm going to choose 22nd and then tap on the right key to select that. Now I have that check mark. The menu is going to stay on a little bit longer, making it a little bit easier for you to go in and change the setting without having to rush too much. At this point, I'll go into color mode, and because I have choose DP standard, it has already put me in a custom color mode. Now if yours doesn't do this, what you simply do is just choose custom from the list. And to show you one thing, you can see right now that in this list, there is no Adobe RGB color mode. Majority of the color mode on this display is really targeted and focused towards gaming. But anyway, we're going to go further into custom color mode and we're going to tweak a few settings. So light tuner, right now this is set to 1. I'm going to pull this down to 0 and just leave it at that so there is no bias going on. For color vibrance, the default is 10. The number that I found worked best for this calibration to get the best conformity to 99% Adobe RGB gamut, or just Adobe RGB reference gamut in general, is to set it between 8 and 9. This is something that you have to determine, and sadly there's nothing in between, for example like 8.5, because that would have been the perfect value. The reason why I recommend between 8 or 9 is because 8 is going to give you a gamut that is slightly less than Adobe RGB reference, and if you choose 9, it's going to give you a color gamut that is slightly larger than Adobe RGB reference. So that's why I say 8.5 would have been perfect. But for me, what I'm going to do with this one is I want to get a larger color for now. So what I'm going to do is go back into the menu again, and for vibrance, I'm going to choose 9. That's going to help out a lot. Go back. Brightness right now is at 100. I'm going to leave this where it is. Contrast, leave it at 50. We're not going to change that. Sharpness is going to be where it is, BI plus, leave that at off, and this is where gamma comes in. So for this, you can leave the gamma at 3. I have been playing with 2 different values, gamma of 3 and gamma of 2. I found that both works fairly well, although gamma of 2 tends to work a little bit better. And the easiest way to think about gamma, even though this is probably mostly incorrect, is that it's very similar to contrast for the display. There's a lot more that goes on behind that, but you can think of gamma that way for the display in general. So I select that at 2. And now for color temperature. Right now, this is set to normal. You can choose bluish, and what normal doesn't really tell you is that normal in other displays would say 6500 Kelvin. For bluish, I believe this is going to be around 7000, if not a little bit higher. And then for reddish, I think this is around 50,000 Kelvin, although I wasn't able to confirm this or check this out in any way at all. But you can see that the color of the display is changing. But what we're going to do later on is that we're going to choose user defined to do a custom RGB calibration to get the best value possible. So before we get into all of those, now that we have most of these settings done, and we can't really change the RGB setting yet, what we have to do first is pretty much go into our calibration software in order for it to start to measure all those metrics. Then we can actually do these values. For that AMA, I have left this at 1, blur reduction left to off, and you can certainly come in and reset the menu at any given time. All right, based on this, we are at a pretty good starting point right now to do the calibration. What I'm going to do next is launch ccProfilier software. And I have CC Display Plus, I have that selected. I will click on advanced mode. Always use advanced mode. Any of my guide I do, I've always showed that. So profiling. And from here, I have chosen BenQ EX3210U is on the display. For the backlight technology, I am choosing RGB LED. And based on my testing, the other one that I've tried is WLED or white LED. From all of my testing I've done, RGB LED tends to produce the best tonal curve tracking. So that's the one that I recommend using. As far as white point, you can certainly try to choose native, and you can set the color temperature on the display to normal. You can certainly do that, but what I have found that works best is to set this to D65 and do the custom RGB fine-tuning. For the luminance, I have mine set to 80. My recommended range is anywhere between 80 to 120 candela. This is ultimately going to depend on your workflow, the environment that you're in, and what you are used to. Because 80 makes the display really dark. However, I found that this works best for printing and for proofing and everything. And even though I'm not printing, calibrating your display darker, it's going to give you a lot more benefit, because then you're looking at the colors at a lower value. So even though the image may be shown on a brighter display, it's still going to look good on those, and you don't have to worry about color discrepancy happening should you ever print in the future. So for me, I am going to shoot sat at 80. Everything else I have left at default. Gamma is standard, which is pretty much 2.2. Contrast ratio is native, and ambient light control and all those things, flare corrections, are all turned off, and that's the way how we want it. Click on next. This is the workflow, and for profile setting, if you're on Mac, you can certainly leave all this at default. If you're on Windows, I recommend coming in and changing the ICC profile version to 2. This way it has the greatest compatibility and no color shift issues that happens with Windows 10 or Windows 11. Click on next. This is where we would choose the amount of patches we're going to use. For this demonstration, I am going to choose small. This way it goes a little bit faster. When you're doing this yourself, I highly recommend choosing either medium or large, because it's sampling a large amount of color. It's going to give you a more accurate profile. But for speed, I am going to choose small for this demonstration. Now this is a screen where we would choose a different option. Essentially, I'm going to check this box, adjust brightness, contrast, and RGB gain manually. Click on Start Measurement. So this is going to tell me to put the colorimeter on the display. I am simply going to tilt the display up, open the thing, rotate it to the back, as you're seeing right now. So just simply pull out, rotate it to the back, and we're going to hang this on the display. There's also a quick guide as well saying that we should make sure that the sensor is pretty much flat on the display. And yes, you can calibrate it in a bright environment as I'm in now, because this is going to work out just fine and there won't be any issues whatsoever. From here, simply press OK, and now you're faced with this option, Profile My Display. You have the option to choose contrast, RGB control, and brightness. You want to check all three of those. Even though contrast, the program won't ask you to do anything anyway, but what we want to do is the RGB control. So we'll click on Next. This is going to do a preliminary measurement to get the various values for the display, for example, the brightness, and then afterwards we'll do the RGB adjustment. So for this, you can see right now that the RGB control is a little bit off, and the best way to go in and do a custom RGB control on the display is to go into the menu, color mode, custom. We're going to go to color temperature. It's user defined, that's good, so we'll press on the right button to go into that. And normally what I do, instead of leaving everything at 100, I would pull everything down to about 90. This way I have room to adjust up or down as appropriate with all three of them. So what I'm going to do first is pull this down to around 90 or so. And notice too that as you start to pull these values down overall, your display is going to get a little bit dimmer, which is perfectly normal and that's fine. So what I'm going to do is set all this at 90 first, and then I'm going to change the value accordingly. So right now, the red and the green, they're pretty good with each other. The blue needs to be a little bit higher, so I'm going to bump up the blue by a few more points. And what we can see right now is that the values are pretty good. My target is 6500 Kelvin. I'm able to get 6432. That's within range. And the XY coordinate for this looks pretty good right now. You can certainly try to adjust things by a little bit to get things closer, but normally what I found is that when you reach that value that's really close, I would just leave it, because any type of minute adjustment you do tend to push things a little bit further off. So I like this value right now. Currently for my display is set to 90, 90, and 92. What I have right now for my RGB value is not going to be the value that you have, so don't be copying this value. Look at the numbers on the screen instead. I'm going to click on Next, and we're going to adjust the brightness for the display. So for this right now, the display is in full blast brightness at 100%. You can simply use this menu to change the brightness here, or if you want to, you can just use this quick menu to change the brightness right there too. I'm going to use the quick menu right now and go there, and I'll bring this down. And I believe to get to the 80 candela, I have to bring this down to about maybe 20 or so. All right, so 20 is a little bit dark. All right, I'm at 78, 79, so let's do 21. That's going to give me around 80, and that's perfect. So you can see that the display is already much more dimmer than it was before. And we're really operating at about 1/3 of the brightness that the full display can do. All right, so click on Next. It's going to run through the calibration process. The menu can be on the display as long as it's not behind the sensor. It's perfectly fine. This is going to measure 118 patches. I'll come back when this is done. We'll speed the video forward. We'll do some testing, and I'll also share with you the result and how you can validate this as well. Okay, so we're done with the calibration. I'll take the sensor off from the display. In fact, I should just leave it there, but I'm going to take it off anyway because the program wants the cover to be fully on. I'll click on Next. It says that the measurement was successful, which is good. That's what we want. And what I will do is click on Next. And this is where I would name the profile. So if you're doing a lot of testing like I am, my recommendation is to name this based on the setting that you use for the testing so that you know exactly what it is. For instance, when I was calibrating this, I use RGB LED as the display backlight information. I set the luminance to 80. I use custom RGB. I will put down cRGB that I'm using. And this is in custom mode, obviously, so I'm not going to put that down. But what I'm going to put next is vibrance. So I put down the vibrance to 9 and also the gamma G to 2. So I'm going to leave that value there. And I will click on Save Profile. You don't have to do all this naming. If you just want to have this be your one profile, that's perfectly fine too. But if you want to delineate it a little bit more, that's what I recommend. So I've saved the profile. There's a few things I'm getting right now. So based on this, the white point, is 64, 94. It's just a little bit off from D65 by like only a few points. That's really great. XY coordinate seems to be really close, mostly right on. The black point I'm able to get is 0.110 candela for the black. That's good. The luminance 79 and contrast ratio is around 772. By the way, anytime you calibrate a display, the contrast ratio is going to go down because you're trying to conform the display in general, the colors to the gamut that you want. So that's something that happens as a byproduct anyway. If you run the display in native gamut, you can normally get the contrast, much higher. That's where the factory panel for contrast ratio comes in. Now, the other thing that you can check as well, at the very top there is the line. And what you want is the curve to pretty much track red, green, and blue as close as possible to each other. In fact, the more overlapping it is, the better they are. However, if one starts to really diverge or two start to really diverge out, that means you're probably not using the correct backlight matrix technology. So you want to go back and change that on your calibration. All right, now that we're done with this, I've saved the profile already. I'm going to do a display QA to run a quality check on this. Notice I haven't pulled the display back in its normal position. That's because I'm going to do this. So this is on this display right now is RGB LED, and for the patch I'm going to use simply the ArtIsRight ColorChecker Classic, which contain 24 patches of the colors that we would see in the world, simplified in a way that the program can run all these analysis. What I'm going to do next, click on Next and Start Measurement. Confirm that this is laying flat on the display and there's no light coming in. Click on Next and we're going to do the validation. This should go by fairly quickly. Now the measurement is done. I'll take the device down, close it up. Click on Next and let's have a look at our result. So based on this calibration so far, the average of all the patches is around 1.2, the lowest being 1.0, and the highest value is around 2.2, with the max being 2.3. Now, this being that it is not a full display for pro usage, the delta E value we're getting on this display is actually pretty good. In the various calibration that I've done, I was able to get the average on all the patches down to around 0.8 and the max under 2 at some point in time. However, this is one of those things that you have to go in and tweak the setting in order for you to really be able to get to those color values. So treat this as a good starting point. This is much better than what you're going to be able to get with just the custom mode without any changes. You can certainly add this to trending and also save out the report. If you're going to save out the report, I highly recommend naming it the same as the profile. So it's EX3210U. And I'll save that out. At this point, you can pretty much just quit the program and you'll be okay. As you can see right there, I have the calibration that I've done in the past that is a little bit lower delta E, but anything below 2 in general, and with just the max being a little bit slightly above 2 in only certain colors, you're going to be fine. That's not going to be a big issue. And now I will show you how to visually examine the color gamut that you're getting out of the profile you just created. On the Mac, it's very simple. Go to Color Sync Utility. And with that launch, I would simply choose Adobe RGB 1998. Click on the little triangle, hold for comparison, and what I will do is load in the EX3210U profile that I've just created and just simply do a comparison. The solid colors are the one that are exceeding the Adobe RGB. The white ones that you see right there, that's pretty much the reference gamut. So there's a few areas that the calibration didn't cover too well, but I wouldn't worry too much about this. And this is also the thing that I mentioned earlier about vibrance setting. Vibrance of 9 will have a gamut overall that's slightly larger than Adobe RGB. Vibrance of 8 will have a gamut that's slightly smaller than Adobe RGB. So choose the one that best fit with your workflow and the way how the image looks on your screen. Preferably if you have a reference image that you're constantly using, that would be even better. And one more thing I want to mention that I didn't mention in the beginning is that you want to leave your display on for around 15 to 20 minutes before you do start the calibration process. This way the backlight has a chance to warm up and stabilize before you run through all these calibrations. So do that in addition to all the settings you need to turn off on your computer before you run the calibration. I hope you find this guide on how to calibrate the EX3210U in Adobe RGB color mode helpful and get the most conform Adobe RGB color gamut possible, and also accurate color as well. If you have any questions or comment, leave them below, give this a like, subscribe, and hit on the bell if you're new, and you know what we trust.